LoreWarrior Campaign, 4th Succession War, Operations Riposte and Ambush. Operation Riposte. The reason the AFFS didn't find any first-line Capellan mech forces waiting to challenge them during the 4th wave was because Chancellor Liao had withdrawn his troops from those worlds and others in late December. He wanted to prevent these troops from being cut off from the rest of the Confederation, and he wanted to use them for an ambitious scheme to cripple the Davian offensive. Chancellor Liao and his advisors, using information from a traitor high within Duke Hasek Davian's command, discovered that all of the many tons of supplies for the AFF forces travelled through 6 worlds: Kawach, Nopa, Basalt, New Aragon, Algot, and Halloran 5. Huge warehouses had been erected on these worlds, and men and equipment from the TNR were brought in to manage the countless crates that flowed in and out. The traitor reported no mech garrisons on these worlds, making them even more appealing as a target. Intelligence officers in the Maskirovka reported further that only a few regiments of infantry and armour would garrison these worlds. This detail, more than any other, probably convinced the Chancellor that his Operation Riposte had a chance of success. The opportunities presented by these 6 worlds were obvious. If the Capellans could destroy the warehouses, all the Davian regiments inside the Confederation would have to halt their offensive. Even their defensive operations would be hampered as they began to conserve their remaining supplies. With the simultaneous combine offensive threatening to close Federated Sun's corridor to Terra, the AFFS wouldn't be able to press ahead, giving the Confederation military months to rest, regroup, and counterattack. During the early planning for Operation Riposte, a 7th world was added to the list. The Capellan Confederation had known for some time that the AFFS had an important research station near its border. Capellan agents also picked up rumours that the laboratories were on the brink of a breakthrough that would substantially improve a mech's strength. The Chancellor's advisors, through months of painstaking examination of all available intel, had narrowed down the possible locations of this lab to a single world: Axton. When he was briefed on the world's potential importance, Chancellor Liao included it in Operation Riposte. The operation required a substantial commitment of troops and equipment. Chancellor Liao decided that the mech units that had retreated during the Davian invasions should get a last chance to redeem themselves in his eyes by participating in Operation Riposte. He also committed some of the best Capellan infantry and armour regiments. The only way to transport these troops was to use the few reserve jump ships and drop ships, some of which had been saved for the evacuation of important personnel and records from threatened worlds. Chancellor Liao was apparently supremely confident of success, despite the cost and the incredible risk of the operation. Davian intelligence later picked up rumours that he'd been so sure of victory, he composed a long, gloating message for Prince Hansa, to be sent as soon as he received word of the mission's victories. Operation Ambush. What Chancellor Liao and his advisors didn't realise was that Prince Hansa had known about the traitor within Duke Hasek Davian's command staff for around 3 years. When the MIIO uncovered the spy and presented the information to the prince, he surprised everyone by not ordering his capture. Instead, he wanted the spy to be watched and his information to be purged of anything truly sensitive. The quote being, "I want to put him on ice for the moment. We might have use for him later." When the AFFS High Command gathered to plan Operation Rat, Prince Hansa realised that he could turn the spy into an unwitting ally, feeding him false information that would induce the Capellans to make missteps. Prince Hansa, with the aid of Field Marshal Yvonne Davian, his second-in-command, drew up Operation Ambush. Operation Ambush went into effect immediately after the invasion started. Reports on the importance of the 6 warehouse worlds began flowing through the staff of the Capellan March Regional Command, where it was certain the spy would read them and pass them on to the Chancellor. These reports, while not entirely false at first, exaggerated the importance of the worlds and minimised the AFFS security measures used to protect them. As the offensive would progress, the reports continued to distort what was happening on these worlds, and by the end of the Davian 3rd wave, Chancellor Liao was receiving information that was almost totally fabricated. The leader of the Confederation was so trusting of this traitor information that when agents from his own intelligence corps, the Maskirovka, questioned this information, he ordered them demoted for doubting the truth. The Six Worlds, while important supply points, were not the only logistical centres being used by the AFFS. There were orbiting warehouse centres around 5 other systems, as well as many regional logistics points on captured Capellan worlds, and even if the Capellan attacks had succeeded, they would have only slowed the offensive. The attacks did have a small chance of success, however, because, contrary to what the Chancellor's spy was reporting, the 6 original target worlds had substantial garrisons. The AFFS positioned 17 mech regiments and 40 infantry and armour regiments on these worlds without being detected, a testament to the Prince's use of the Pony Express rather than Comstar to pass his orders. And though there was no proof that Comstar had been selling or trading information, every message sent via Comstar was read by 100 people on its way from New Avalon to the front. The risk of a leak somewhere along the way was enough for Prince Hansa to develop his own system for passing orders. When the Davian mechs participating in the 4th wave of the invasions began reporting that they hadn't encountered any Capellan mechs, the High Command guessed that Chancellor Liao was about to launch his counteroffensive. Davian officers gathered on the garrison troops in the worlds of the 6 warehouse planets to maintain strict radio silence and to evacuate certain vital supplies or hide them far from the rest of the warehouses. Then they waited. A few marshals worried that the Chancellor might prove himself a more devious opponent, ignoring the Federated Sun's bait and striking elsewhere. Apparently they had reason to worry because it was later learned that Senior Colonel Pavel Rydzik, commanding the Capellan forces near Terra, had proposed a completely different offensive strategy that could have caused the Federated Suns a great deal of difficulty. Chancellor Liao's distrust for his senior colonel and trust for his highly placed spy made him follow his own instinct and ignore a plan that could have greatly injured House Davian. Algot. The 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Ariana Fusiliers got the honour to attack the small, fertile world of Algot and its 2 supply centres. A Maskirovka agent had discovered the locations of the depots through what he thought had been a purged access code to the planet's computer net. According to the information gathered by the agents, the 2 warehouses, one in the north near the desert city of Kassel and the other near Lake Ochiba, were filled with vital dropship and fighter parts. Protecting these supplies was a single infantry regiment. Being allowed to command his battalion on the mission was a privilege. Major Samuel Stark didn't deserve, however. Major Stark blamed himself for the beating the Fusiliers took on Tikhonov because he'd been one of the few to convince the regiment's now dead commander to attack the approaching Davian forces when they had been ordered to stay in their defensive positions. Afterward, Major Stark's troops prevented him from killing himself, and he submitted his resignation. Chancellor Liao, in his orders to the battalion, brushed aside the resignation and stated that he was supremely confident of Major Stark's ability to avenge his unit's defeat and strike a major blow for the Confederation. As a further show of his confidence, the Chancellor sent Major Stark a secret and experimental cataphract mech to pilot. The 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Ariana Fusiliers, along with the survivors from the other 2 battalions, had 50 mechs and warriors and a similar number of aerospace fighters. Supporting them were 2 regiments of hover tanks and 1 jump infantry. A company of Fusiliers, the survivors from the 1st and 2nd battalions, was assigned to destroy the smaller complex of warehouses in the north. After their successful drop onto the wide, hard plain west of the warehouses on January 11th, Captain Banbury ordered his company of mechs and the attendant hovercraft and infantry to spread out in attack formation, with hovercraft on the point and flanks, and then the strike lance, fire lance, and command lance with the troopers bringing up the rear. They advanced to within 10 kilometres of the supply centre before elements of Delta Company, 1st Battalion of the Davian Light Guards, engaged them. Delta Company, led by Captain Andrew Redburn, chose not to engage the approaching Capella mechs directly. Instead, Delta Company moved to strip the enemy of its hovercraft while staying out of range of the enemy's heavier weaponry. 2 kilometres from the warehouses, Delta Company turned and fled before the Capellans could pursue. A combined barrage of artillery and strafing runs from 6 aerospace fighters stopped them dead in their tracks. 5 Capella mechs and 10 hovercraft went down. When the barrage would stop, Delta Company, now reinforced by a company of heavy tanks, attacked. The light mechs of Delta used their superior maneuverability to close before the Capellans could get their bearings and lay down an effective pattern of fire. Once within range, Delta Company halted and used the area's few hills as cover. As the Capellans tried to push forward, Captain Redburn ordered half of his company to launch themselves into the air while the rest provided covering fire. The fight quickly degenerated into a melee, and though by that time they were outgunned and outmaneuvered, the Capellan forces made good fight of it. A Capellan marauder showed great skill in fending off 2 of Captain Redburn's company and 2 tanks, and after his mech had lost both arms and its autocannon, the pilot attempted to eject. The autocannon shells inside his mech detonated before he was clear, starting a chain reaction that caused a tremendous explosion. After 15 minutes, the Capellan mechs were finished, and the hover tanks and troopers were now fleeing. Captain Redburn's company had once again proven that lighter mechs, when in sufficient number and led by a capable officer, could take on heavier machines. The main Capellan thrust then took place in the south. The 3rd Battalion, led by Major Stark in his brand new Cataphract, confused the Davian defenders by splitting its forces, half dropping east of the warehouses and half to the north. Colonel Stone, the commander of the Light Guards mech regiment and overall commander of Davian forces on Algot, misplaced his troops for a divided threat. Only a regiment of light armour protected the northern approach to the warehouse complex, and the entire Light Guards and Alpha Regiment of the 12th Vegan Rangers lay in the east. Major Stark, leading the Fusiliers Heavy Mech Company from the north, easily pushed through the Davian tanks and marched into the warehouse complex. Remote cameras mounted on some of the warehouses recorded the scene as Major Stark, with great deliberation, raised the right arm of his Cataphract and fired the PPC at the warehouse doors. When he saw that they were empty, he hesitated momentarily, and then ran his mech to the next building, discovering the same thing. The Major went warehouse to warehouse, blasting or kicking open doors, only to find the same vast emptiness. The most unfortunate person in the universe had to be the Davian warrior in his Stinger, who appeared just as Major Stark had blasted the doors off the last empty warehouse. Major Stark ordered his company to capture the smaller mech, which they did after a brief fight. Declaring that it was time to test the grip strength of the Cataphract, Major Stark had his mech grab the Stinger by the cockpit section, and slowly the mad officer tightened his mech's grip on the enemy mech. With a sickening pop and curl of electrical smoke, the cockpit collapsed under the strain. A twist of the Cataphract's wrist ripped the flattened head section off the Stinger. Pushing past the now headless mech, Major Stark ordered his company east to join the rest of his battalion, which had just engaged the Light Guards. Colonel Stone, warned by scouts that the company of mechs was now fast closing behind him, tried to disengage from the rest of the Fusiliers. The Fusilier foot soldiers, like fleas on a dog, slowed his mech's retreat to a crawl. Major Stark's mech slammed into the lighter Davian machine, still afire with rage, pushing his new Cataphract to the limit, destroying 3 enemy mechs single-handedly and assisting in 2 other kills during the hour-long melee. The Davians' huge numerical superiority was no help to them in what became known as the Battle of Stark's Fury. Every time 2 or more Davian mechs tried to gang up on a Capella mech, a suicide charge by APCs or a platoon firing Inferno SRMs or some other interference would stop them. An hour before sunset, Margrave Sheridan Douglas arrived with the 12th Vegan Rangers. Margrave surveyed the battle and decided to form his mechs into what he called a flying wedge. With his mech at the point of the V formation, they slowly marched into battle. Each time the formation reached a Capellan mech, the Rangers stopped and concentrated fire. Where Capellan warriors turned to face this slow advance, they were hit from behind by the Light Guards. The flying wedge eventually reached the Davian Light Guards, and with superior numbers and firepower, the Davian forces cut down the remaining Capellan mechs, all except Major Stark and his Cataphract. The Major's warrior skill, as well as a chance to examine a new mech design, moved Colonel Stone to offer him a chance to surrender. His reply was simple. He charged Colonel Stone, yelling over the communications channels that he was going to skin him alive. The Light Guards calmly stood their ground and fired at the charging mech. The Cataphract, which was extremely well armoured, finally collapsed at the feet of Colonel Stone's victor. Axton. The raid against Axton came as a complete surprise to the Federated Suns. The marshals of the AFFS, perhaps a bit overconfident, had assumed that the planet's importance was a well-kept secret, and that the best way to keep it secret was not to draw attention to it. This was why the planet, though close enough to the Capellan Confederation to warrant a heavier garrison, had only the 2nd NAIS training cadre and 4 regiments of infantry and tanks. The 1st Battalion of the 4th Tau Ceti Rangers, survivors from Tikhonov, were ordered to find and retrieve whatever it could from the AWFS labs and destroy what it couldn't carry. To assist the Rangers, the Chancellor also sent along a platoon of Death Commandos. The Rangers dropped northeast of Baros, Axton's capital city, on the 14th of January. Just outside the city was Fort Vanders, home of the training cadre, and the most likely location of any secret labs. Major Tompkins, commander of the Rangers, and never a believer in subtlety, swept into the base with weapons blazing. The Rangers, in a stroke of luck, found Fort Vanders almost deserted. Most of the training regiment were on manoeuvres, leaving only a company of mechs and an infantry regiment to protect it. The cadets, though game and fighting on familiar ground, were completely outclassed, half the warriors being killed, the others retreating off base to await the rest of the regiment. Even more luckily than finding the base under-defended, the Capellans actually discovered the entrance to the labs. A salvo of missiles had missed their target during the fight and demolished what seemed to be an ordinary warehouse. After the battle, the Capellans noticed stairs leading down. As the Capellans were exploring their new discovery, the NAIS regiment was assembling to the south. Major General Quentin Dravers had a difficult decision. He'd been ordered to protect the research lab at all costs, but he was also responsible for the lives of these young cadets. These cadets were just as valuable to the Federated Suns as anything in the lab. As he was discussing his dilemma with his officers, the general received word that the Capellan dropships were on their way to the fort. Correctly guessing that the dropships were now arriving to pick up the Tau Ceti Rangers and their booty from the labs, rather than to bring any reinforcements, he decided to risk positioning his forces to block any rendezvous. He formed a special company of mechs made up of the regiment's instructors and the best students to attack the Rangers as they prepared to board. The dropships landed on the parade grounds of the fort, and as the Capellans were assembling near the labs to return to the boarding site, General Dravers' company attacked. To avoid the heavier guns of the dropships, he hoped to ambush the Capellans as they passed through the maze of buildings on their way to the parade grounds. But the Rangers, with the aid of the Death Commandos, covered their movement, allowing most of the mechs to reach the dropships. General Dravers was killed as he tried to stop 2 mechs that were carrying off a computer file station that they found in the labs. The Capellans escaped from Axton. What they captured from the research labs at Fort Vanders is classified. Cowich. A motley collection of companies and battalions, all survivors from Capellan regiments, lost during the Davian invasion, were ordered to destroy 3 warehouse complexes on Cowich. A battalion from House Hiritsu thought that it would have the easiest time. The battalion's target was a group of warehouses outside Samanan that, according to intelligence reports, was almost completely undefended. They arrived above Cowich on the 12th of January, and as they dropped and assembled to advance, they learned that they were facing more than a few militiamen and some security guards. Tank and infantry units from the 21st Striker Regiment, a regiment from the famed Eridani Light Horse, were waiting in ambush as the mechs of House Hiritsu passed. Time and again, a peaceful grove of trees would sprout cannon and laser fire, and before the Capellans could react properly, they grew quiet again as the Eridani forces rushed to their next ambush spot. By the time the Capellans reached their objective, they had lost a company of mechs. Then Colonel Winston, commander of the 21st, sent his mechs in. The 3 battalions of mechs using the hilly terrain around Samanan easily engulfed the Capellans. Though the warriors of House Hiritsu did fight with skill, it wasn't enough. There were no survivors. The Eridani Light Horse lost a single warrior. Colonel Winston collapsed while piloting his battlemaster and died at the regiment's field hospital soon after. Major Jamal Falahay, Colonel Winston's executive officer, assumed temporary command of the regiment. A battalion from the 3rd Confederation Reserve Cavalry, a company from Trimaldi's Secutors, and a company of Lothar's Fusiliers were assigned to destroy the 2nd supply depot at Jammu. Approaching from the north, the commander of the strike force, Major Jeremy Carlson of the Reserve Cavalry, hoped to speed through the large plain outside Jammu and into the base. They didn't expect to find 3 regiments of infantry and armour, reinforced by the 2nd Battalion of mechs from the 1st Guards RCT, dug in and waiting for them. Realising he had no chance of completing his mission's objectives, Major Carlson ordered his troops to veer to the northeast, where he prayed to meet with his dropships. Some of the more patriotic warriors among the Capellans disagreed with the Major's orders and broke ranks. Mixed forces, now totaling about a company in strength, charged the Davian position, and fell quickly in the well-prepared kill zones generated by the mechs and tanks of the Davian forces. Major Carlson attempted to save the situation by using the confusion of the battle as a screen to slip the main body away. Fighters from the guards easily picked up the trail of the Capella mechs and began to hound them with strafing runs. Their efforts gave the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the Guards Mech Regiment the chance to catch up. In a group of hills, the Capellan and Davian mechs met, and an hour later only the Davian forces walked away. The 3rd group of Capellan forces, made up of a battalion of Trimaldi's Secutors and 2 companies from Laurel's Legion, Major Arthur Cheng of the Secutors was in a precarious position as leader of the strike force. The 2 companies from Laurel's Legion had been practically kidnapped from their homeworld, and now they were many light years away from their world and angry about the situation. The atmosphere between the rebellious Legion and the loyal Secutors was openly hostile. Major Cheng's mechs were assigned to take the massive warehouse complex at Dotara. After dropping onto the planet's surface, Major Cheng ordered the 2 companies of Laurel's Legion to assume scout positions ahead of his Secutors. The mechs of the Legion were lighter and therefore better equipped to act as scouts, but the Major also obviously found it advantageous to keep the disgruntled women of the Legion in the front, where his warriors could keep an eye on them. The lead elements of the Legion encountered patrols from the 3rd Crucis Lancers RCT. Some of the Legion opened fire on the Davians, some would immediately surrender, and others just retreated. The Secutors would attack the 2 companies of Laurel's Legion when they saw the defections. As the 2 Capellan forces now fought with each other, the mechs of the 3rd Crucis Lancers easily surrounded them. After watching the Capellans fighting for a few minutes, the Lancers waded in with a volley of withering firepower. Major Cheng, realizing the situation was now hopeless, ordered his troops to surrender. The Lancers seized 23 mechs, 21 warriors from the 2 companies of Laurel's Legion, who survived the fight and offered their services to the AFFS. Marshal Pedroza of the 3rd Lancers listened to their story and arranged to have the warriors reunited with the rest of their unit on Tigris, while their case was sent to New Avalon for review by Prince Davian. Basalt. The fighting on Basalt centered on the cities of Controssa and Xander's Delight, both on the mountainous southern continent of the large, humid world. Maskirovka agents learned that the AFFS had constructed 2 storage depots. The one at Xander's Delight was constructed on the banks of a large lake, while the one at Controssa was built around a spaceport. Several mech battalions and companies, totaling almost a full regiment, were assigned to destroy these depots. Supporting the Capellan mechs on Basalt were 3 infantry regiments and 4 armour regiments, twice what other strike forces had received. A company from the 1st Kerr's Intruders, a company from McCrimmon's Light Cavalry, and a company from McGregor's Armoured Scouts dropped north of Xander's Delight, early on the morning of the 8th of January. A Capellan infantry regiment and a light tank regiment landed to the northeast, while a 2nd tank regiment made up entirely of hovercraft landed on an abandoned island, many kilometres away. The plan, drawn up by Major Davina Crivella of Kerr's Intruders, was for the infantry and hover tanks to attack first. While the Davian defenders, which Major Crivella thought were no more than a regiment of infantry and armour, were facing the south and northeast, the Capella mechs would attack and accomplish the mission. The plan failed, miserably. The initial drive by the Capellan infantry and light tank regiments, through a spectacular lightning storm, ran into a mechanised infantry regiment from the 4th Guards RCT. Because of poor communications in the raging weather, the Capellan infantry couldn't stop the hovercraft from leaving their island to attack. Kilometres away from land, a battalion of hovercraft from the 4th Guards along with 4 Lyran hydrofoils, lent to the AFFS in 3025, surprised the Capellan hovercraft, destroying a battalion amid the roiling waves of Lake Xander. Those that survived would met the guns of a heavy tank regiment and light mech company waiting for them on shore. With their diversionary attacks now stalemated to the northeast and smashed to the south, the mechs attempting to take Xander's Delight fared even worse. As the furious discharges of lightning would disrupt their communications, the Capellan warriors advanced, assuming that everything was going as planned. They first met a lance of light mechs from the 4th Guards who shot off flares to warn their fellow warriors. Pushing aside the Davian mech patrol, but fearing the worst, Major Crivella hoped that her mechs could reach the warehouses before the enemy could respond. The mechs of the 4th Guards are known for their quick response, and as the Capellans approached their objective, more and more Guards mechs responded to the flare signals and harassed the enemy's advance. During a 10-minute running battle, the Capellans lost more than half of their mechs. The remaining mechs, badly damaged and surrounded, stood at the edge of the warehouse complex. Colonel Rassos, commander of the 4th Guards mech regiment, offered the Capellans a chance to surrender. Major Cravella declined, saying that her personal honor demanded that she at least partially accomplish her mission. Colonel Rassos stepped his mech aside, offering her a clear view of the closest warehouse, and Major Cravella understood and let loose a salvo of missiles that shattered the doors. Once the smoke had cleared, she saw the cavernous, empty interior. She and the rest of the Capellans then surrendered. Meanwhile, 5 companies from the 1st New Hessen Irregulars and 18 mechs from the veteran House Igiuri, along with 2 infantry and 2 armoured regiments, were attempting to destroy the warehouses at Controssa. Their plan, created by Major Ishoka of House Igiuri, began with what the Capellan military calls an avalanche drop, in which all of the Capellan forces drop on top of their targets, even though this means dropping into the teeth of the enemy's defences. The warriors of the mission, particularly the members of House Igiuri, were extremely grim and determined to succeed. The directness of the avalanche drop appealed to them. Defending the warehouses at Controssa were the 4th Crucis Lancers, who'd been expecting a more conventional attack and had scattered their troops to man defensive lines. As the drop began, tracking systems warned the Lancers that the Capellans were risking everything with their daring choice of drop zone. Major General Charles Duncan ordered the Lancers back from their perimeter, but too late. By the time the Lancers could even begin to respond, the 1st Capellan mechs were already hitting the dirt. The Capellans' first order of business was to secure a perimeter and then to begin raiding the warehouses for the supplies that they could carry to dropships landing at nearby spaceports. With dropships landing and the Davian response still a few minutes away, the Capellans found the warehouses completely empty. They still had time to reach the spaceport and retreat from Basalt, saving themselves to fight another day, but the Capellans were so infuriated they chose to make the Davian defenders pay for deceiving them. They set off north and ferociously attacked a battalion of mechs and tanks. The commander of the 2nd Lancer Mech Battalion, Major Sandra Falarak, realizing that she was outgunned and facing angry opponents, decided for retreat. As her unit slowly retreated, it drew the Capellans farther and farther from the spaceport, and rather than relieve the 2nd Battalion, the rest of the Lancers moved to cut off the Capellans from their dropships. The 2nd Battalion led the Capellans as far as it could, but Major Ishoka finally ordered a return to the spaceport. The Capellans then found mechs, tanks, and soldiers blocking their every turn. General Duncan, feeling confident of his position, gave the Capellans a chance to surrender, to which they responded with a demand that the Davian forces surrender. The next 20 minutes of explosions and thundering of running mechs put all the Capellan mechs out of action, most permanently so. New Aragon. The 3 battered regiments of the Chesterton Voltigeurs were ordered to destroy the warehouses on New Aragon. They had had several months to recover from their beating on Tikhonov. By the time they'd received their orders for Operation Riposte, the warriors of the Voltigeurs were ready to redeem themselves. The 4 battalions of Capellan mechs were split to attack the 3 most likely locations of warehouses. 2 regiments of infantry and a heavy tank regiment reinforced each group. The 3 targets formed a triangle on New Aragon's northern continent of Glastonbury, so the plan was for the 3 strike forces to drop and attack separately, and then rendezvous with their dropships in the centre, near a town called Balton. The 3rd Battalion of the 1st Chesterton Voltigeurs, commanded by Major William Gazen, was assigned to attack the supply depot at Fort McMichael. Dropping north of the target on the 6th of January, Major Gazen ordered his infantry and tanks to protect the flanks as his mechs marched southward. Major Gazen's plan was to strike quickly with his light mechs and move on, letting the tanks and infantry mop up any resistance. His battalion ran into 2 companies of assault mechs from the Davian Heavy Guards RCT. Surprised and completely outgunned, Major Gazen ordered his battalion to fall back, hoping to lure the Davian troops forward so his heavy tanks could attack them from the sides. Just as this plan seemed to be working, Major Gazen saw flashes on the right and left, as the tanks he'd been counting on were themselves being attacked by Guards hover tanks responding to the Capellan sighting. Before Major Gazin had time to devise another plan, his battalion was attacked by 12 fighters from the heavy guards. Even the swiftness of the Capellan mechs couldn't save them from the accuracy of the Davian fighter pilots, and in a matter of moments, the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Chesterton Voltigeurs was reduced to a handful of desperately fleeing mechs. The 1st Battalion of the 3rd Chesterton Voltigeurs fared only a little better, assigned to attack the complex of large, recently built buildings near the spaceport of Grahamsville. Warriors of the 3rd Chesterton speculated that the warehouses contained 30 of the new, prized Hatchetman medium mechs. The thought of rebuilding the regiment with new machines made the warriors impatient to complete the mission. The battalion's commander, Colonel Maxwell Leng, chose drop zones that would force him to cross the Graham River to reach the target. This didn't concern the colonel because maps showed the river as small and relatively easy to ford. Even if the river proved difficult, the colonel felt that he would have plenty of time to find a safe crossing point. Defending the supply depot at Grahamsville was the New Avalon Crucis March Militia, nicknamed the Little Foxes. The collection of mechs, armour and infantry had always tried to style itself after the RCTs in the Brigade of Guards, designated as a defensive unit for a region of the Federated Suns that hadn't seen action now in hundreds of years. The Little Foxes never had a chance to prove themselves. Operation Rat gave them this chance. Prince Davian, not wanting to use detachments of frontline units to protect conquered worlds, had decided to break tradition and ship key militia units to the front for garrison duty. The New Avalon Crucis March Militia was one such unit. Commanding the militia was Major General Edward Valos, a 20-year veteran of the Crucis Lancers, and when General Valos accepted command of the unit in 3027, he thought he was accepting a quiet posting as a prelude to retirement. Less than 2 years later, he was now on New Aragon defending empty warehouses with a collection of untested soldiers who were just as shocked as he was to be so far from home. The Capellan force now advanced unchallenged toward Grahamsville, heightening the confidence of the Voltigeurs. Even Colonel Leng took their unhindered approach as a good omen, as he changed his mind when his troops marched out of the thick forests and saw their objective and the river that ran in front of it. The river was flooded. The sudden heat of the planet's summer rapidly melting snow in the distant mountains and swelling the Graham over the banks. The Capellan troops also got their first look at the massive concrete walls, studded with embrasures that rose from the opposite riverbank. Colonel Leng's reliance on outdated maps had given him an incredibly difficult task. The Capellans tried to secure 2 bridges north and south of the logistics centre, but Davian combat engineers destroyed those before the enemy could seize them. The Voltigeurs did discover that the imposing wall rising from the river did not extend around the rest of the depot. It was just a flood wall that had been equipped with defences by the engineers. Colonel Leng had his mechs carefully wade across the river, out of range of the Davian stronghold, while his hovercraft and tanks diverted their attention with attacks. The attack got off to an inauspicious start. River currents washed away 3 Capellan mechs and 2 hovercraft, the rest of the mech battalion making it across. And while the Capellan tanks and hovercraft continued their assault, the Voltigeurs marched north to strike at the vulnerable belly of Grahamsville. The Voltigeurs collided with the mechs of the Little Foxes just 2 kilometres from their target, and during the fight, which included suicide charges by the Capellans, the warriors piloting the aging militia mechs pushed the Voltigeurs back. General Valos and Colonel Leng both receiving major wounds that took them out of action. Surprisingly, the loss of their leader hurt the Capellans more. The New Avalon Crucis March Militia, while stunned and a bit disoriented, regained composure and renewed the attack under the General's executive order. The Voltigeurs, on the other hand, were completely demoralised by the wounding of their leader and the stiff resistance of their opponents. The mech warriors of the Voltigeurs broke and ran, the faster units of the militia pursuing and catching up with them in a small valley, and after a brief final battle, a company of warriors and many other Capellan soldiers surrendered. The third group of Capellan mechs, 2 battalions from the 2nd Chesterton Voltigeurs, dropped just south of Fort Ellison. Assuming there would be only a few defenders, the commander of the 2nd Chesterton, Colonel Paula Lannis, spread her forces too thin. Defending Fort Ellison were the Aragon Borderers and 6 infantry and tank regiments, and upon learning of the enemy drop, the Borderers dispersed to lance and company units to wait behind hills, in gullies, and in thick groves of trees. Scouting Voltigeur mechs were attacked by 2 lances of borderers that seemed to rise up out of rocky slopes that they'd just passed. Another firefight began when a lance of Voltigeurs marched past a grove of trees only to be attacked from behind by a company of tanks that had hidden there. Ambushes like these continued as the Capellans approached the fort. The Voltigeurs still managed to push the Davians back to the outskirts of the warehouse complex when the borderers, almost having to retreat and give up the warehouses to the Capellans, a terrible loss, since the warehouses at Fort Ellison were among the few that actually did contain supplies. Just as it seemed that the Confederation would win, the fighters of the Heavy Guards, their fight long done, arrived to begin a series of bombing runs that seized the initiative from the Voltigeurs. After regrouping, the borderers counterattacked and pushed the Capellans back. Colonel Lannis ordered the Voltigeurs to head for the rendezvous point, and for the next 2 days the Capellans stayed 1 step ahead of their pursuers, which now included elements of the Davian Heavy Guards. Colonel Lannis and her warriors didn't realise, though, that above New Aragon their dropships were being attacked by the combined fighter force of Heavy Guards, the Aragon Borderers, and the New Avalon Crucis March Militia. The remainder of the 2nd Chesterton Voltigeurs arrived at the rendezvous point only to witness the fiery crash of one of their dropships, and with no escape, Colonel Lannis surrendered. Nopa. Of the 7 worlds attacked by the Capellan Confederation during Chancellor Liao's Operation Riposte, the battle for Nopa was the most evenly matched contest. Capellan commanders considered Nopa more important than the other worlds because of rumours, planted by the MIIO, that there was an important AFFS communications and record centre, as well as 2 supply depots on the world. Capellan troops hoped to give the Capellan military an extra month's rest with the disruption caused by destroying the communications centre. The 3rd Battalion of the 1st Macaron's Armoured Cavalry was ordered to attack the logistics centre at Whitehall. In a style that was typical of the Big Mac mercenaries, Major Ursula Ajax landed her battalion in a very tight zone, almost on top of the depot. She wanted to complete her mission in the shortest time possible, even if it meant a messy fight. Beta Regiment of the 12 Vegan Rangers had assembled its assault mechs into battalions placed at strategic positions around the depot. The 2nd Battalion then were the first to contact the invading Capellans, and Major Ajax's warriors, shocked at the presence of the Vegan Rangers, fell back. After they reorganised, the Capellans' skill and their spirit took over, and in a series of well-executed counterstrokes, they gained an upper hand. They'd almost succeeded in splitting the Ranger Battalion in 2 and entering the depot when the Rangers' 1st and 3rd Battalions finally arrived. Outnumbered, Major Ajax paused briefly to decide what to do, and in that brief pause she failed to see the Ranger stalker on her right. They let loose a salvo of fire that immediately crippled her machine, forcing her to eject. The rest of Major Ajax's forces attempted to hold the line and find a way past the Vegan Rangers, but they could not. Down to just 2 companies of mechs, the armoured cavalry tried to reach the nearby forests, but again the Rangers were 1 step ahead of them. The Capellan warriors knew that they couldn't rendezvous with their dropships, nor that they dare surrender and shame the regiment's name, so the warriors decided to fight a guerrilla action. Using the Rangers' expectations, they would try to fight their way forward toward other forces. The remaining Big Mac forces eluded the Rangers entirely in a thick fog. Since then, the members of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Macaron's Armoured Cavalry, have reappeared many times to strike at military and civilian targets on Nopa, usually taking ammunition and parts with them into the hills. As of writing, the AFFS have decided to bring an expensive spy eye surveillance satellite to track down the guerrillas. The Crater Cobras were assigned to defend the large complex of warehouses near the Nopa city of Grisanders. There are 2 main approaches to the city, from the north through the Grisanders Hills and from the east through Mead Valley. Attacking Grisanders were 2 Capellan battalions, one from the Confederation Reserve Cavalry and the surviving mech warriors from the House Lusan. Instead of combining their troops, the commanders decided to land at separate zones near Grisanders to guarantee surprise. The battalion from the Confederation Reserve Cavalry, commanded by Major Tunner, approached from the east, stumbling into the mechs of the 2nd Crater Cobras. Ambushed in what was supposed to be a surprise attack of their own, the Capellans floundered. Attempting to execute a fighting withdrawal failed, and the Cobra's firepower quickly consumed the reserve cavalry. The cavalry commander did, however, warn the mechs of House Lusan about what was happening before they entered the Grisanders Hills. Forewarned, the officers of House Lusan faced a difficult decision. They could continue the mission, knowing that the other regiment of Crater Cobras were waiting to strike, or they could withdraw to their dropships to fight another day. Many warriors were survivors of House Lusan's loss on planet Liao, and they knew the odds of surviving against a waiting regiment of heavy mechs were extremely slim, and that Chancellor Liao would be best served if they withdrew. Other mech warriors had been drawn from the House Lusan training program to fill out the battalion, and their lack of experience led them to believe that honour was better served by sacrifice. The prospect of a second loss of honour outweighed the commander's better judgment, and the battalion continued the mission. At a point where the hills pinched the road, the first Crater Cobras struck. Using their infantry as spotters, the Cobras called in artillery barrages that took out a few of the Capella machines and routed the Green Warriors. Then the mechs of the Black Cobras, so named for their black and silver paint scheme, moved to crush the disorganized enemy. The heavy mechs of the Cobras moved in companies amid the twists and turns of the hills, easily cornering most of the inexperienced warriors of House Lusan. Despite their earlier quest for valor, most of the young warriors were quick to surrender. The veterans then of House Lusan, about a company, were much tougher. Attacked by a battalion of Cobra heavy mechs, the company skillfully withdrew, and might have escaped altogether had it not been for the Cobra's fighters, which continually harassed them, slowing their retreat. The end came for House Lusan near Becker's Creek, where the Black Cobra's only light company had raced ahead of the Capellan troops and blocked their path long enough for the heavier companies to catch up and deliver the coup de grace. The most evenly matched content on the planet occurred between the 2nd Capellan Hussars, the Prefectorate Guard, aided by several conventional regiments, and the 1st Seti Hussars RCT. The Capellans set out to destroy the spaceport and the communications facility southeast of Kokula. Because of the facility's supposed importance, Chancellor Liao assigned a company of the new Cataphract heavy mechs to the 2nd Hussars. Colonel Braxton Gammon, commander of the Capellan Hussars, chose a drop zone east of Kokula. As his troops were assembling after the drop, an infantry platoon killed a Davian soldier in a village, and though the soldier died without saying anything, his uniform immediately identified him as a member of the 1st Seti Hussars RCT. The Capellan Hussars and the 1st Seti had met before. During the Second Succession War, the Prefectorate Guard were part of a Capellan invasion force who were attacking the Davian world of Aosia. During a counterattack by the Seti Hussars, some of the Capellans broke and fled, allowing the Davian troops to cut off the rest of the unit. During the ensuing fight, Chancellor Ilsa Liao was killed, and though the warriors of the 2nd Capellan Hussars are taught a different version of what happened there, this fiction gives them plenty of reasons to hate the 1st Seti. The Capellan mech regiment then approached Kokula was now eager for revenge, and in the initial engagements the heavier Capellan machines pushed back the Seti Hussars with ease that both cheered and worried Colonel Gammon. At Stongton's Crossing, with the infantry support too far ahead to aid, the lead elements of the Capellan March Regiment were attacked by 1/3 of the Seti Hussars RCT. A storm of infantry, tank, artillery and mech firepower reduced the Capellan Hussars by 2 companies. The infantry and army units attempted to double back and counterattack the Seti Hussars, but they themselves were intercepted by a second group of Seti Hussars. Colonel Gammon regrouped. Most of the Capellan warriors were incensed that they had been ambushed so easily, and they wanted to avenge their fallen comrades. The Capellan Hussars swung north in an attempt then to outflank the Seti Hussars. Meeting no resistance, they travelled through the thick forest that surrounded Kokula. The warriors thought that they had outmanoeuvred their AFFS opponents and were about to achieve their objective. The Capellans' confidence, though, collapsed as they emerged from the forest. Arrayed in front of them were 2/3 of the Seti Hussars, who attacked immediately. Colonel Gammon ordered in his fighters, but they were at an airfield kilometres away, and the Seti Hussars pounded the Capellans for 10 straight minutes before the fighters arrived. Then Davian fighters would engage them in a dogfight that prevented them from aiding their ground forces. The mechs on both sides advanced, colliding in clouds of explosions, dust and burning mech armour. At first it seemed the Capellans had the upper hand. The cataphracts used by the command company advanced deep in the Seti Hussars' lines, causing them to waver. But then the arrival of the 3rd Battalion of the Seti mechs and 3 tank regiments of the RCT ended any hope for a victory. Colonel Gammon tried to rally his troops and retreat before he was surrounded, but his forces were too involved and intertwined with the Seti Hussars to disengage in time. The 3rd Battalion of the Seti Hussars slammed into the Capellan troops and began to cut them down, and after an hour, Colonel Gammon surrendered what remained of his forces. Halloran 5. The 15 remaining members of the once proud Fremont's cuirassiers were ordered to destroy the warehouse on Halloran 5. The company, commanded by Captain Jerome Fremont, whose father had been the regiment's commander, were eager to exact revenge and strike a blow for the Capellan Confederation. The company's mechs, 6 Marauders, 5 Javelins, 3 Stingers and a Phoenix Hawk, were well equipped, though small in number. Captain Fremont ordered that all his mechs be painted blood red and that the regiment's insignia be painted twice the normal size on the front and back. The company of mechs, reinforced by 2 regiments of armour and infantry, dropped just south of Vanders, Halloran's largest city, and during the early hours of the 13th of January, from orbit, the cuirassiers had seen the vast complex of buildings just outside the city, and assumed that they had to be the warehouses. Captain Fremont felt the southern approach would give him the best and fastest approach. Instead, he was charting the demise of the cuirassiers. 20 kilometres outside of Vanders, the scout lance of the cuirassiers, reinforced by a company of hover tanks, ran into a company of assault mechs from the 2nd New Iverson chasseurs. Stunned, the Capellan mechs and tanks fell back in disarray. Captain Fremont ordered his troops to the west, hoping that he would be able to avoid the chasseurs, and an hour later he then met the 1st Battalion of the chasseurs. He was also being strafed by the aerospace fighters of their company, and though the cuirassiers could have pulled back and rendezvoused with their ships, Captain Fremont ordered an all-out attack. The surprised chasseurs found that the terrain prevented them from manoeuvring and bringing their superior firepower to bear on the enemy, and forced back, the chasseurs called for help. The 2nd Regiment of the Screaming Eagles responded, eager to dispel the disrepute that had followed them from New Canton, and the Eagles fell upon the left flank of the cuirassiers. Despite the valour of the Capellan warriors, which saw Captain Fremont's marauder take down 2 Davian mechs, the 15 mechs of the cuirassiers were destroyed, and their pilots either killed or captured. Overview. What Chancellor Liao had thought would be his masterstroke to halt the Davian offensive and regain the initiative had turned into a horror story. Because of Prince Davian's use of disinformation, the Capellan military now found first-line AWFS regiments instead of warehouses of easy booty to collect. The Capellan military lost 6 regiments of mechs and aerospace fighters, twice that number of tank and infantry regiments, 3 dropships being completely destroyed, and 1 captured. A jump ship that broke down had to be abandoned in the Halloran system. Adding insult to this injury was news that in early February, the AWFS had captured Senior Colonel Pavel Ridzik. Reports were sketchy as of the writing, but this much is known. Colonel Ridzik, after his narrow escape from Tikhonov, fled to Elgin, and from there he continued to coordinate the Capellan forces that were cut off from the rest of the Confederation by the Davian invaders. Either MIIO operatives or a dissident political group on Elgin captured the senior colonel as he dined at a restaurant, and as the colonel was being dragged out, an explosion flattened the building, his exact whereabouts remaining a mystery as this work went to press. The only success of Chancellor Liao's Operation Riposte was the 4th Tau Ceti Rangers' successful raid on the research labs on Axton. Unless they captured some dramatic bit of technology that will enable a Capellan mech to fight like 20, it's unlikely that anything will compensate for the pummeling the Capellan Confederation took at the hands of the Federated Suns. And for a little postscript of this rather long part of the episode, let's have some funsies at the Capellan casualties. Unit: Capellan Hussars. Redlanders, World Cyan. Result: not engaged. Good result. Prefectorate Guard, Liao. Light casualties: escaped. New Aragon, surrendered. Blandford's Grenadiers, on Capella, weren't engaged. Good on them. Northwind Highlanders. You had Marion's Highlanders on Ningpo. Moderate casualties, relocated to Northwind. McCormick's Fusiliers on Elgin, not engaged, also went to Northwind. 1st Kearney Highlanders on Highspire, not engaged, relocated. 2nd Kearney Highlanders were on Jonathan, suffering moderate casualties, also relocated to Northwind. The Chesterton Reserves, with the 1st Ariana Fusiliers on Algol, 2 battalions destroyed, 1 retreated without casualty. 2nd Ariana Fusiliers on Tikhonov, 1 battalion destroyed, 2 escaped, remaining forces destroyed. Ariana Grenadiers on Tikhonov, destroyed. 1st Chesterton Voltigeurs on Tikhonov, moderate casualties retreated, then on New Aragon, remaining forces surrendered. 2nd Chesterton Voltigeurs on Tikhonov, 2 battalions destroyed, 1 escaped. New Aragon, remaining forces surrendered. 3rd Chesterton Voltigeurs on Tikhonov, moderate casualties but retreated. New Aragon, remaining forces completely destroyed. Hamilton's Highlanders, 1st Battalion on Tikhonov, destroyed. 2nd Battalion on Alreshka, destroyed. Lofar's Fusiliers, 1st Battalion were on Epsilon, not engaged. 2nd Battalion on Sirius, not engaged. 3rd Battalion on Tybalt, heavy casualties, one company escaped. On Kawich, the remaining forces were destroyed. Sung's cuirassiers on Wei, not engaged, and Kingston's legionaries on Heligoland, not engaged. Liao reserves included Tremaldi's Secutors, 1st Battalion on Zurich, defeated, one company escaping, but then on Kawich, remaining forces destroyed. 2nd Battalion on Barat, not engaged. 3rd Battalion on New Canton, heavy casualties. Vincent's commandos, who were on Liao, destroyed. Blackwind Lancers, 1st Battalion on St. Andre, surrendered, and the 2nd and 3rd Battalions on Milos weren't engaged. The St. Ives Armoured Cavalry, the 1st St. Ives Lancers were on St. Ives, not engaged, the same for the 2nd, and the Chevaux Legueurs on Warlock, not engaged. However, Justinia's cuirassiers on St. Andre surrendered. Devon's Armoured Infantry on Brighton weren't engaged, while Stapleton's Iron Hands on Tikhonov suffered moderate casualties but escaped. Cochrane's Goliaths on St. Andre were destroyed, and Shepard's Mounted Fusiliers on Texlos weren't engaged. The Confederation Reserve Cavalry, 1st Confederation Reserve Cavalry on Liao, 2 battalions completely wiped out. New Aragon, remaining forces destroyed. The 2nd Confederation Reserve Cavalry on Palos have yet to be engaged, while the 3rd Confederation Reserve Cavalry on Karach were destroyed completely. The 4th Confederated Reserve Cavalry, first being on New Canton, surrendered and then drowned. The 2nd Battalion on Elgin weren't engaged, but the 3rd Battalion on Stike surrendered. The 5th Confederation Reserve Cavalry, the 1st Battalion being on Singhai, weren't engaged, and the 2nd on Larsha weren't engaged. Capellan Reserves, including Justine's Grenadiers, 1st Battalion on Elgin, weren't engaged, and the same for the 2nd on Sirius, but the 3rd Battalion on Saif completely destroyed. Stapleton's Grenadiers, 1st Battalion on Wazan, 2nd Battalion on Campetone, and the 3rd Battalion on Les Salles, not engaged. The Sarna Reserves, Horlock's Hussars on Remshield and Tsingtao, not engaged. Fremont's Cuirassiers, 1st Battalion on Hunan, moderate casualties, but were then destroyed on Halloran. The 2nd Battalion on Jonathan, completely eliminated. McCrimmon's Light Cavalry, 1st Battalion on Ningpo were destroyed, and the 2nd Battalion on Slocum suffered heavy casualties, and one company escaped. The remaining forces were then surrendered on Basalt. 3rd Battalion were on Pleione, who were destroyed. McGregor's Armoured Scouts, 1st Battalion were on Tikhonov, were completely destroyed, while the 2nd Battalion on Alreska were defeated, with a company escaping to Basalt, who then surrendered. Tikhonov's reserves, with Kincaid's Rangers on Repulse, were lucky to not be engaged, whereas Kerr's Intruders' 1st Battalion on Ronald suffered heavy casualties and a single company retreated, where the remaining forces were surrendered on Basalt. 2nd Battalion on Tigris were destroyed, and the 3rd Battalion on Sirius were fine. Mercenaries, McCarran's Armoured Cavalry, the Night Riders on Arboris suffered 2 battalions destroyed and 1 retreated, and then on Nopa they suffered heavy casualties. Meanwhile, Barton's regiment, the Wild Ones, Leo's Demons, Rob's Renegades, were all on Menka and weren't engaged. The 4th Tau Ceti Rangers, 1st Battalion on Tikhonov, suffered heavy casualties but retreated, and then suffered light casualties but were successful in their raid on Axton. The 2nd Battalion on Siam weren't engaged, and Laurel's Legion on Tigris suffered 2 companies forcibly retreated and a single company defeated. Subsequently, they defected. On Kawich, the remaining forces then defected to House Davian. Hampton's Hessens, located on New Hessen, the 1st New Hessen Irregulars were suffered 2 battalions destroyed and a single retreated, while the 2nd New Hessen Irregulars were destroyed. New Hessen Armour Scouts on Westerhand were yet to be engaged. And finally, all the warrior house regiments of House Liao, we had House Imara on Cyan, who weren't engaged. Neither were House Kamata on Beetlejuice. But House Hiritsu on Tigris suffered a battalion destroyed who retreated, and then on Karach the remaining forces were destroyed. House Lusan on Laos lost a single battalion, and their remaining troops on New Aragon were destroyed. House Daiichi on Drozan, not engaged, while House Fujita, 1st Battalion being on Grand Base, weren't engaged, but the 2nd Battalion on Stike were destroyed. House Matsukai on Bithynia weren't engaged, whereas House Sijori first engaged the enemy, and Aldebaran, losing 2 battalions, and then finally Basalt, where they were completely destroyed. The book, obviously being written from the perspective of Dr. B. Banzai from the NAIS, does not acknowledge the losses of the Davian forces. But that does indeed conclude Book 1 of the Military Atlas of the Fourth Succession War. There is a Volume 2 that concludes the conflict. I will be continuing with that. The book is quite good if you are lucky enough to still have an actual dead tree version of it. It is a very handy little book. It is very well put together. The maps are good. The scenarios you can create for it are endless. There's some interesting challenges for people playing as the Capellan forces in there, and there's even a section at the back of the book that allows you to just roll up your own forces should you want to create your own conflict on the many worlds that were attacked, with entire systems set up to explain all of the veterancy levels of all the different units and that kind of thing. So nice little addition in the book, and then they have ones specific for every single unit that was involved, from the light cavalry, Team Banzai, Wolf's Dragoons, through all of the Capellan units, the Cretan units, the Lyran units. It's very good. It's very well put together. I will be discussing the quality of the PDFs after I finish Book 2. I have some choice words for some of the decisions that were made. As a quick shorthand on that, it is not good. The book from the PDF version are very, very poorly put together. I wish I was joking. But outside of that, I have probably gone on long enough. This is a hell of a long episode. I do apologise for there probably being just big sections where there's just a single map. The book has the maps, which is nice, but the book also lacks things like artwork for mechs, for instance. So there's no kind of scene setting artwork. There's no pictures of any NPCs or anything like that. You mostly just get the maps, which on the one hand is good, but then on another one it means that, yeah, certain planets get mentioned. Other planets get completely missed out, which is the unusual part about it. I would have liked maps for every world during each sort of section of the conflict, but it just seems to be very specific ones. But yeah, I'll leave it with that. Have a good one, everybody. Thanks for listening, as always, and I will catch you for part 1 of the second book. Well, in the not too distant future. Until then, have a good one. Bye.